Hello, welcome to the podcast Risk for 21st Century Families. Ashley and John are here, and today we're going to discuss the risk of violence poses to our families, and we're going to try to address the why it's a risk, what some of the causes are, what the consequences are for your family, and what some of the solutions can be. So thank you both for being here today. Let me start by talking about the why it's a risk. Violent behavior tends to be easily learned and transmitted from just one example. So if a child, for example, sees some violence, they can easily replicate it. And then number two is that it can become part of a family environment where violent behavior becomes an acceptable norm, where parental violence or abuse or children's violence toward one another, this is how we handle things in our family. Number three is that the violence, another reason why it's a risk is because it begins to affect individuals and therefore virtually every relationship. So violence is a tremendous detriment, unless it's war, a tremendous detriment, see, when people express it in the environment that is supposed to be loving and kind. And it tends to unsettle everybody. One of the, this is more a consequence, but it actually becomes a cause, because when people experience violent behavior, researchers have found that it takes from 3 to 7 days for them to return to the emotional equilibrium that people had before the violence. Well, that individual who is upset can either be somebody who retreats from it or somebody who perpetuates it. So we actually are training in some families children to be violent people. So it turns out to be a significant issue for families, because there's a plague of violence in American society in a lot of places, and it's become, forms of it have become way more acceptable nowadays than it was, say, the previous generation. So in my opinion, it's a huge risk for families.
Let's talk about what is acceptable, and what that means. Like people are just tolerating more, they see it more and they're not as bothered by it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, if you had a fist fight on the school bus, for a lot of people, I would say, well, that's pretty commonplace. Or slapping and hitting. I noticed there's quite a few uh, um, videos out about men slapping women and then women hitting men back. And what they're saying is now the women are now toughened up. Well, the women just are as violent as the men, so there's no benefit. But those forms of behavior publicly in the media, you see more of them, and therefore I conclude that it's a little more acceptable if you do that. And then there's other forms of mistreatment that are not physically violent, like isolating people, ruining somebody's reputation on the internet, and then ganging up on some kids. And you could, for example, look at one sample of YouTube's videos and see all of those. Somebody ganging up on somebody, somebody hitting somebody, other kinds of violence. So
Think
it's exposed to everybody.
in that vein, you hear stories, you read stories about somebody being bullied at school, and you hear stories of like, oh, that's just boys being boys, or something like that. So it's acceptable in the sense that I don't think people are addressing it, um, or recognizing it for what it is.
One of the things that's evidence that it's acceptable is the political rhetoric that has become hugely violent. And our politicians are now, talking about killing, sabotaging. They use violent terminology against their political opponents. And
Yeah, just with words.
yeah,
Yeah.
so we have a violent language emerging that is, and because there's not a widespread emphasis on stopping that, then that's by definition makes it somewhat acceptable because we tolerate it.
So then it's a risk to society, which can then impact or bring risk to community, then it can bring risk to family. So it's pretty broad, pretty layered.
I think so, and I think that it's a much greater, more huge concern, and we probably ought to have more emphasis, both politically and socially and religiously, probably than we do to prevent it from occurring.
I saw just a quick search, the National Institute of Health called it a contagious disease, that it actually fits the definition of a disease and it spreads from one person to another. Um, and that, that makes it scarier even.
Isn't that interesting that intense behavior like that is contagious? And we imitate it and learn it and try it out. And I've often wondered why positive behavior it doesn't appear to be as contagious, but I actually think it is. But we don't follow it as much. You know, the kindnesses that are shown probably motivate people to be kind as well, except it's not as noteworthy. And maybe what we ought to do is commit to talk about kindness more, or thoughtfulness, or love, or tenderness, or sharing, or cooperation more than we do.
Yeah, they're just more subtle behaviors, aren't there? Anger and violence get the attention and are just more visible. Yeah.
Well, okay, let's move on then to what we see as the causes and what appear to be the causes of violence, and and then begin to address that. Now, Martha probably has an answer to that question, I'll bet.
She does. We asked, what do family experts believe are the causes of differing types of violence in American society that impact families? And this is her response.
That's a complex and important question. Family violence, whether physical, emotional, or systemic, is influenced by multiple layers of factors. Family experts often point to several key causes. 1. Intergenerational patterns. Violence can be passed down through families as a learned behavior, the cycle of abuse where children grow up witnessing violence and may repeat it in adulthood. 2. Social economic stressors. Poverty, unemployment, lack of education or healthcare access create intense pressures that can escalate into domestic conflicts and abuse. 3. Cultural norms and gender roles. Traditional beliefs about power dynamics within families, e.g., male dominance, can normalize aggression against women and children in some communities. 4. Mental health issues. Untreated depression, anxiety disorders with anger components like intermittent explosive disorder, substance abuse issues all correlate with higher rates of family violence. 5. Societal factors and media influence. Exposure to violent content in media and entertainment has been debated for desensitizing people toward real-life aggression, while systemic racism, gun culture also play roles nationwide affecting certain communities more severely than others.
Well, she gave a lengthy but probably profound answer, didn't she? So she identified at least what appears to be six causes, and all of the subtopics that we could talk about fit in one of those at least. But I would also, while we're talking about this, like to add among the causes about how much of this goes on. See, a lot of people fail to appreciate that over a third of the girls in our society have been the recipient of some form of sexual violence, if we call it sexual abuse or sexual activity, and not quite a third of the boys. It's that widespread. And then if we talked about the bullying and the hitting and fighting and all that stuff that goes on, and you ask yourself, well, what percent of the kids have had some experience, say, with violent behavior? We're approaching 50%, which is a shocking percentage, in my opinion.
And is that all in all forms, something at school, something on TV, something on the internet?
Yeah, if we included the internet and social media, it'd be more than 50%.
Yeah. And movies. Everybody's seen it in movies.
So
Yeah.
we're focused. Oh, go ahead, Ashley.
I was just gonna read this list I found of it was specifically referring to domestic violence, but it just shows how many facets there are to children experiencing it. So they're exposed to violence by seeing violent acts, hearing violent acts, being assaulted during the incident, seeing the injuries resulting from the violence, being told about the violence, and experiencing the aftermath, such as their parents' depression or having to relocate or things like that. And that's just like one act, and you could have all of these different consequences and different experiences with it.
Well, okay, let's focus. Thank you for that. So we've established it's pretty broadly available. Let's take a look at what we'd call as the causes. One is the breakdown of society, the sense of community where people were not drawn together and committed to engage in behavior that is positive and calm and so on. So we have that. Two is we got societal norms where if they change and violence is more acceptable, then it can become sort of the way we handle things. You can have in any philosophy violence in order to protect your property, or violence in order to respond to somebody's misstatement or something like that. So those are causes of societal breakdown. Family conflict would be one, where parents have unbridled anger and conflict, and that's interpreted as violence. And neighborhood, and then I think one of the causes is the failure for us to have a broadly based teaching program in our institutions that focus on the alternatives to violence. You guys have any other ideas about causes?
When you were talking about society, what I find interesting is there's, a big debate in terms of how social media platforms are being asked or discussed in terms of how they monitor the content that they deliver. And so the question I have is, is it on our society to enforce that limitation? And if so, what would that even look like to be able to enforce that? So
To enforce, go
the,
ahead.
the limitation of content delivery. So including, if people say or do something of a violent nature, be it, egregious to uh, just online bullying. I don't want to say just, but trying to think of a spectrum. Um, can we force these social media platforms to limit, to monitor that and not allow it? And I don't even know if that's possible.
Yeah.
Well, directly, maybe not, but we could push them to have a more benevolent and more constructive forms or demonstrations of behavior, especially how to handle situations. Religions do that all the time. We emphasize kindness and turn the other cheek and loving one another and so on. And you could ask the media platforms to do the same thing. And informally, if you spend more time doing that, then there's less time available for the other stuff to occur. You're talking about the Second Amendment rights. You can't eliminate people's free speech in order to curb violence. Yeah, that gets to be the problem. But the solution, in my opinion, or part of the solution would be to see if we could get a lot of social institutions, businesses and churches and schools to give emphasis to it and let kids believe and see that it's widespread in our culture, and then shut down exposure to social media.
Yeah. And know to turn it off. Yeah.
Okay, but what about the consequences? What actually happens to people, either the perpetrators of violence or the victims of it or the witnesses of it? Those three groups. What do you think happens as the consequences of violence to those people?
There's
Just in general, I read that they are all groups are more likely to grow up if they're children to be perpetrators or victims. And so it just continues and spreads to more and more people. So that's one consequence.
I don't think there's a way to build trust between people and among groups and so then you can't grow as a person, you can't grow relationships. Um, and so you lose a lot when there's violence involved in among people.
I think there's a lot of work that says that perpetrators, victims, and witnesses tend to isolate themselves from others because of violence. And that supports your idea that it interferes with the building of high quality relationships. We would there are other more personal or intimate forms like when you're around violence, you're more likely to justify breaking promises or covenants or agreements. So if there's violence in marriage, you're justified in the divorce. You're justified perpetrating violence if you're the victim of it. One of the things that is astonishing to me is that witnesses of violence are as affected negatively as victims of violence. So if a child is not the victim but sees violence in the family, that child who's the witness is as likely to carry out a violent behavior or be affected emotionally. I think it subdues emotions, it prevents healthy emotional growth. I think it ruins, you mentioned trust. I would be specific and say it ruins trust in things like love, whether or not you're loved and whether or not you love somebody, which I think is a huge problem in our society. I also think that it makes it difficult for people to just cooperate and unify. And so we see a perpetuation of social fragmentation where you have this little group and that little group and so on. And that's the real danger. Societies break down when there's no unity or very little of it or not enough of it. And that is a trend that, in my opinion, in some places we're rapidly approaching.
Well, see, that can exist at all the levels in society, in the community, in the family.
I think there's support for that. When people find out what percent of American families are two-parent families and the old traditional nuclear families, they're shocked to find out what the percent actually is compared to families where single-parent families, unwed mother families, so on, where people are in isolation from one another. So are we ready to talk about solutions?
I think so.
Let's do it. We need it.
We should end on something positive, don't you think?
Right.
Well, I would offer this. I would offer that one of the very best places to seek for a solution would be the families themselves, and that parents in rearing and teaching their children emphasize the importance of strategies other than violence. I'll give you an example. Two of my children years ago got into a squabble and one hit the other and the other hit back, and I stopped it, and instead of asking, there's a really dumb question that parents often ask, it's who started it? So don't ask that question. And and so they're hitting each other, and I explained to them that that was not acceptable in this family, and that they had to learn to talk things over and to regulate or control themselves so they didn't hurt each other. So I said to them, "You're probably going to have to be punished. You're probably going to have to learn to do something." And the little boy said, "What do we have to do?" And I said, "Well, you're going to have to learn how to care for one another." And he said, "Well, what if we won't do it?" He's still angry. And by that time, I had become a more effective father. And so I said, "Well, how long can you live without eating?" And my wisdom won. And I said, "So here's what I want you to do. I want you to play a game happily all the way through that I choose. And I want you to learn to play happily with each other." And so I picked a game. It was called Sorry. It was the toughest game I could find for them to play because you take the other person's players off the board. See, and they say sorry, and you take them. Then I had them come and spend 15 minutes talking to each other right in front of me. And then I asked them to pop the popcorn for our family home evening that night. And so they learned to cooperate. And then I said to them, "Now, I want to see examples of the two of you talking and being friends in this next week." In my experience, since they're grown adults now, whenever we have family gatherings, I watch the two of them find each other. And almost there's no evening that passes along without them having checked. So I may have helped create a long-term friendship in the process. I just got to the point where I wouldn't tolerate any form of violent behavior. I had to learn to control my own anger, and I come up with strategies where we talk, and I could hug them and hold them and say, "This is not acceptable. You need to learn," and so on. So I think that's one thing parents could do is don't accept any of it ever, but don't get violent or angry at your kids.
What would you say about media? You know, it is in all the action movies and the fun movies and
Well, if you're watching a movie at home and you could, it's a stream movie, you could stop and start it. Occasionally, I would suggest that parents stop it and say, "What does that person feel right there? And what's that person going to do? And what would be a better option? And then let's take a look at the whole thing and see what happens because of this person who did violent things." You could use a video, a movie, for example, to teach, and you could use some examples of violence in a movie to go home and say, "I want you to talk. I want us to talk about this," and make sure that they know that there are alternative ways. And then after that, you could say, "Now, I propose that what we do as a family is commit ourselves to care for each other more this week and with our friends. So I'm going to ask this question. How did you help somebody at school today?" I'm going to ask that question every night at dinner. And I want you to tell me what you did to help somebody instead of hurt them. I did that once, and my kids looked like I'd spoken in a foreign language. So I kept asking, and finally they began to tell me things that they were doing that helped others. So that tickled me to see what they came up with. So I like that quite a bit. So they can do that in families. I also would suggest they restrict the exposure to any source of violence instead of saying, "Well, is it rated R because of sexual scenes?" Well, is it rated R because of violent behavior? See, we don't ask that question.
right.
It sound in your explanation. It also what I heard was what a value would be to teach empathy. So when we pair that in with what you just said, limit it, but also things happen, and if we can teach our kids to understand empathy and empathize with what people are feeling, the perpetrator and the victim, that can help them recognize, and
Yeah,
hopefully lead to better emotional resilience.
what a great observation. Can you imagine what would happen if every set of parents taught their children to have empathy? and compassion and kindness and tenderness and so on. It doesn't make you a weak person to know that. I think a lot of people are afraid to teach that because they think it makes them weak. I'm old enough to have been one of the very first coaches of girls basketball teams, in the city league. And so I played basketball. And so I was teaching the girls on my team a little bit about basketball, how to rebound and pass and dribble and so on. And I went to the first game, and the other team just were physically moving our girls around, and we were losing the game. So the parents of our team were sitting right behind me, and I turned around and said, "What do you think? Should I teach these girls to be aggressive?" And one mother said, "That's a good way to be nowadays." And I should have said, "I'm willing to do that if you're willing to teach the difference between assertiveness and aggression." So I called timeout and brought the girls in and said, "Okay, I want you to each go out there and foul somebody. It's a true story." And they said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, just go whack their arm," and so on. And they were a little hesitant, but eventually they got the hang of that. And we even toward the season had some girl who was known as our hatchet girl, and I look back on that and I think, wow, that wasn't all that great to do that just to win a game, and so on. At the time, it seemed a little funny, because girls were a little timid and so on. But I was always interested in that mother's comment. It's a good way for girls to be nowadays. And I thought, although I think being able to stand up, being able to be assertive is okay, but not aggressive. So I never did that again with one of my girls' teams. Just want you to know that I had one trial learning and then stopped.
He learned fast.
We've talked about the different levels. So, and you just shared some solutions within the family, but how do we move that to community and society? How do we bring these ideas to our schools and so that we can have an impact and find solutions to violence for our local community?
Well, you could, for example, go to your public school and say, "I want us to develop as a school a program that emphasizes these positive pro-social forms of behavior so that we limit the bullying and the hostility." I participated in one, and it virtually eliminated all forms of bullying within 30 days. And it just was based on the idea of doing what helps people and avoiding what harms them. So schools are a good place. Churches could be as well. But I think churches that are teaching about the gospel of Jesus Christ, for example, should be teaching kindness and love and patience and empathy and so on. But you could do even more of it inside churches. You could get at it at work as well, by the way, because I think it is this type of informal violence, not physical violence particularly, goes on in the workplace a lot. Sabotaging reputations, competing and mistreating somebody in order to get a promotion. It happens a lot.
So we can have.
Well, that's one thing I think we could do.
Yeah.
I also think more people would be interested in that if somebody came along and said, "Hey, let's do something together." I think we'd get a lot of takers. People who would like to see something improve.
Yeah.
Well, so good. Thank you both. I think we also have enough, so if we wanted to, our next podcast could continue this discussion. So let's talk about it between now and then and see if the two of you think it's a viable topic. Otherwise, thanks to all our viewers and listeners, and we hope that this podcast will motivate you to be more kind and more thoughtful and hopeful and help your kids be the same. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the First Answers podcast, which is sponsored by firstanswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids, with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Find First Answers on Facebook, and remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or whichever platform you use, and let us know what you think about First Answers. Check out another podcast by Dr. Scoresby called The Christ Questions, which is centered on questions we ask about Jesus Christ and questions he asks us. Dr. Scoresby examines how Christians can build faith in Jesus Christ that lasts and discover the true blessings and rewards for believing.